Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. Here, we bring you chilling tales to keep you on edge while helping you unwind. If you enjoy our stories, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Got a creepy story of your own? Share it in the comments below. We might feature it in a future video. Now sit back, relax, and let the story begin. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just 4 friends, a campsite deep in the woods, and a roaring campfire under the stars. Mike, Jessica, Lauren, and Dave had been planning this trip for weeks. They were all seasoned campers, excited to unplug from their busy lives and enjoy some time in nature. The campsite was perfect, far from any other campers, and nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. They spent the first day hiking, fishing in a nearby stream, and setting up their tents. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. It was around 10 p.m. when they heard the first sound. "Did you hear that?" Jessica asked, her marshmallow pausing halfway to her mouth. The others stopped talking and listened. It sounded like footsteps, faint but deliberate, crunching on the forest floor not far from their camp. "Probably an animal," Dave said, trying to sound casual, but he grabbed the flashlight beside him anyway. The footsteps grew louder. Then, from the darkness, a man stepped into the flickering light of the campfire. "Evening, folks," the man said with a wide, toothy grin. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing a faded jacket and jeans. His face was weathered, and his eyes glinted strangely in the firelight. He carried a small backpack slung over one shoulder. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Mike, being the self-appointed leader, spoke up. "Hey there, can we help you?" The man stepped closer, hands raised as if to show he meant no harm. "Sorry to bother you. I'm just passing through. Saw your fire and thought I'd say hello." Something about him felt off. His grin lingered too long, and his eyes darted around the camp like he was sizing it up. "You camping out here alone?" Lauren asked cautiously. "Yep," the man replied, his grin never faltering. "Just me and the great outdoors." He gestured to the trees around them. "It's peaceful out here, don't you think?" "Yeah, it is," Jessica said, her voice strained. The man squatted near the fire, uninvited, and held his hands out to warm them. He didn't seem in any hurry to leave. "What brings you out here?" Mike asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "Just needed to get away," the man said vaguely. Then, after a pause, he added, "You never know who you'll run into out here." The words hung in the air, and the unease among the group grew palpable. Dave stood up, holding the flashlight. "Well, it's getting late. We were just about to call it a night." The man didn't move. He just kept staring into the fire, his grin fading into something more neutral. "Right," he said finally, standing up and brushing off his pants. "Guess I'll head back to my camp." "Where's your camp?" Lauren asked, unable to stop herself. The man paused and turned to her. "Oh, not far." He didn't elaborate. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. "That was weird," Jessica said, breaking the silence. "Super weird," Lauren agreed. "You think he's really camping out here?" Dave asked, still clutching the flashlight. Mike shrugged. "Who knows? Let's just make sure everything's locked up tonight." They doused the fire, triple-checked the zippers on their tents, and went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. Around 2 a.m., Jessica woke up to the sound of something, or someone, walking around the campsite. She froze, holding her breath as she listened. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, circling the tents. "Mike," she whispered, nudging him awake. Mike groaned softly, but quickly sat up when he heard the noise. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice cutting through the silence. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling the trees. Then, from just outside the tent, the man's voice replied. "Didn't mean to wake you." Jessica's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you want?" Mike demanded. The man didn't answer. Instead, they heard him walking away, his footsteps fading into the distance. By morning, the group was on edge. They debated packing up and leaving, but ultimately decided to stay, rationalizing that the man was probably harmless, just odd. That night, they built the fire higher than usual and kept their flashlights and a knife nearby. No one wanted to admit they were scared, but the tension was thick. Around midnight, as they sat around the fire, they heard it again, footsteps. This time, they were louder and faster, like someone was running toward them. The man burst into the clearing, wild-eyed and panting. "Help me," he gasped. The group jumped to their feet. "What's going on?" Dave demanded. "He's coming," the man said, his voice trembling. "He's been following me all night." "Who?" Mike asked, his own fear rising. The man didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a burning stick from the fire and spun around, holding it out like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted, but there was no one there. The group stared into the darkness, their flashlights scanning the trees. "Maybe we should call the cops," Lauren said, reaching for her phone. Before she could dial, the man suddenly bolted into the forest, screaming. "Wait!" Mike shouted, but he was already gone. They didn't sleep that night. Instead, they sat huddled around the fire, waiting for sunrise. When it finally came, they packed up and left without looking back. They never saw the man again. To this day, they wonder, was he running from someone real, or was the danger always him? It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a chance to disconnect from the world for a few days. Evan, Lisa, and their two friends, Tom and Sarah, had rented a small, rustic cabin deep in the Adirondack Mountains. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, a single room with bunk beds, a small kitchen, and no cell service. But that was the point. "We need this," Lisa had said as they packed their bags. "No phones, no work emails, just us and nature." The first day was perfect. They hiked a nearby trail, fished at a crystal-clear lake, and cooked their dinner over the campfire. As the sun dipped below the tree-line, they sat outside, watching the stars appear one by one. "This is amazing," Sarah said, leaning back in her chair. "Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen the sky this clear," Evan agreed. Tom was poking at the fire with a stick when he suddenly froze. "Hey, did you hear that?" Everyone fell silent. In the distance, barely audible over the crackling fire, was the sound of faint laughter. "Probably other campers," Lisa said quickly, though her voice wavered just a little. "Maybe," Tom said, still staring into the woods. The laughter faded, and they shrugged it off. It wasn't unusual to hear other people in the woods, even this far out. They went to bed not long after, the sounds of the forest lulling them to sleep. The next morning, they found a surprise waiting for them. As Evan opened the door to step outside, he noticed something on the porch. It was a piece of paper, folded neatly, with a rock placed on top to keep it from blowing away. "Guys, come look at this," he called. The others gathered around as he picked up the note and unfolded it. Scrawled in messy, uneven handwriting were the words, "You're not alone. Leave while you can." For a moment, no one said anything. "Is this a joke?" Sarah asked, looking around nervously. "Probably just some kid messing with us," Tom said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Lisa said, trying to stay calm. "It's probably nothing. Let's just enjoy the day." They decided to brush it off and went about their plans. They hiked a new trail, swam in the lake, and tried to forget about the note. But the atmosphere felt different. Every rustling branch, every snapping twig made them jump. Even Tom, who was usually the skeptic, seemed on edge. That night, they locked the cabin door and made sure all the windows were shut. They sat around the small dining table playing cards, trying to laugh and pretend everything was fine. Around midnight, there was a loud thud on the roof. "What the hell was that?" Lisa whispered, her eyes wide. They all froze, straining to hear. Then came another sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the roof. Evan grabbed the flashlight and signaled for everyone to stay quiet. He slowly opened the door and shone the beam of light onto the roof. Nothing. But as he stepped back inside, he noticed something in the dirt just outside the cabin. Footprints. "Look at this," he said, pointing them out to the others. The footprints were fresh, leading up to the cabin and then around it. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Whoever left the note was serious," Evan said. "Maybe we should leave." "It's the middle of the night," Lisa pointed out. "Let's wait until morning." Reluctantly, they agreed, though none of them got much sleep. When dawn finally broke, they packed up their things in record time. As they loaded the car, Lisa noticed something on the side of the cabin. "Guys, come here," she called. Carved into the wood were the words, "You were warned." That was enough for them. They sped down the dirt road, leaving the cabin and whatever, or whoever, was out there behind. Later, when they stopped for gas in a nearby town, Evan mentioned the strange events to the clerk. "You were up by the old Ridgeway cabin, weren't you?" the man asked, his tone serious. "Yeah, why?" Evan replied. The clerk shook his head. "Locals don't go near that place. Too many weird stories. People hearing voices, finding notes like the one you got. Some folks think it's just kids messing around, but others..." He trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. Evan didn't press for more details. They got back in the car and drove home, vowing never to return to the cabin again. Camping by the cliffs was supposed to be an unforgettable experience. Josh, Mia, and their longtime friend Ethan had been talking about it for weeks. The cliffs were a lesser-known spot, tucked away in a remote part of the countryside. The view from the edge was stunning, rolling hills stretching out as far as the eye could see, with the occasional hawk soaring overhead. "I can't believe we finally made it," Mia said as they set up their tents. "Best spot we've ever camped," Josh agreed, hammering a stake into the ground. Ethan, as usual, was taking pictures. "Just wait until sunset. This place is going to look incredible." The day passed peacefully. They explored the area, found a small stream nearby for fresh water, and even spotted a family of deer grazing in the distance. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they cooked dinner over a portable stove and talked about everything from old high school memories to future plans. "This is what life's all about," Ethan said, lifting his mug of instant coffee. But their perfect trip took an unsettling turn after dark. It was just after 10 p.m. The fire was crackling, and the stars were out in full force. Josh and Mia were roasting marshmallows while Ethan sat back in his chair, scrolling through the pictures he'd taken. "Hey," Ethan said suddenly, lowering his phone. "Do you guys see that?" "See what?" Josh asked, turning around. Ethan pointed toward the cliffs. About 50 yards away, near the edge, a faint light was flickering. It wasn't the kind of steady light you'd get from a flashlight or lantern. It was more like the wavering glow of a candle. "Is someone else camping out here?" Mia asked, frowning. Josh shook his head. "We didn't see anyone when we got here. And it's not exactly an easy place to get to. Maybe it's just someone hiking," Ethan suggested. "In the middle of the night? By the cliffs," Mia said, her voice tinged with doubt. They decided to ignore it, assuming whoever it was would keep to themselves. But the light didn't go away. It stayed in the same spot, flickering gently, almost hypnotically. "All right, this is weird," Josh said after a while. "I'm going to check it out." "Josh, no," Mia said quickly. "What if it's, I don't know, someone dangerous?" "It's probably nothing. I'll just take a quick look," Josh said, grabbing his flashlight. Ethan sighed and stood up. "If you're going, I'm coming with you." The two of them made their way toward the light, with Mia reluctantly staying behind at the campsite. As they approached, they realized something strange. The light wasn't stationary. It seemed to drift slightly, as if swaying in the wind, but there was no visible source. No lantern, no candle, nothing. "That's not normal," Ethan said, his voice low. Josh shone his flashlight around, searching for any sign of a person. The beam of light swept over the rocky ground, but there was no one there. "All right, let's head back," Josh said uneasily. But as they turned to leave, a loud crack echoed behind them. They spun around to see a jagged piece of rock had broken off the cliff's edge. The light, which had been hovering just beyond the edge, was gone. "Let's go," Ethan said quickly. They hurried back to the campsite, where Mia was waiting anxiously. "What happened?" she asked, seeing their pale faces. "There's no one out there," Josh said. And no explanation for the light. The rest of the night was tense. They tried to focus on other things, playing cards by the fire and telling stories, but the mood had shifted. Around 2 a.m., they heard it, a loud thud not far from their tents. Josh grabbed his flashlight again, his heart pounding. When he shone the light in the direction of the noise, he saw it immediately. A large chunk of rock, about the size of a basketball, lying in the grass. "Did that fall from the cliff?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. Ethan looked up. "It had to. There's no other way it got here." But something didn't add up. The rock was too far from the base of the cliffs to have simply fallen. It was as if it had been thrown. "All right, that's it. We're packing up and leaving," Josh said. "What? In the middle of the night?" Mia protested. "Would you rather stay here and see what happens next?" Josh shot back. Reluctantly, they began dismantling the campsite, working quickly under the beams of their flashlights. As they loaded the last of their gear into their car, Ethan glanced back toward the cliffs one last time. There it was again, the light. But this time, it wasn't flickering. It was steady, and it was closer than before. "Guys, we need to go. Now," he said. Josh didn't need to be told twice. He started the car, and they sped down the narrow dirt road, leaving the cliffs behind. None of them spoke until they reached a gas station miles away. "What do you think it was?" Mia finally asked, breaking the silence. "I don't know," Josh admitted. "But whatever it was, it didn't want us there." Ethan nodded. "Next time, let's just stick to a regular campground." They all agreed. And though they never returned to the cliffs, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the light wasn't just a random occurrence. It felt deliberate, like something, or someone, had been watching them all along. For their annual camping trip, Alex, Nicole, and their friend Marcus decided to explore a new spot they'd heard about. A remote lake nestled deep in the woods, known for its crystal-clear water and serene surroundings. It wasn't a campsite in the traditional sense. There were no designated areas, no facilities, and certainly no other people around. That's the whole point, Alex had said when he suggested it. No crowds, no noise. Just us and nature. The idea was to paddle across the lake in rented kayaks, set up camp on the far side, and spend the weekend fishing, swimming, and relaxing. It sounds perfect, Nicole had agreed, though she was a little nervous about how isolated the location was. Marcus, always up for an adventure, simply grinned. Let's do it. They arrived at the lake late in the morning. The water shimmered in the sunlight, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. This is amazing, Nicole said as they unloaded their gear. You haven't even seen the best part yet, Alex replied. After a smooth paddle across the lake, they found the perfect spot to set up camp. A small clearing with a sandy patch near the shore. See, told you it'd be worth it, Alex said as he started unpacking. They spent the afternoon exploring the area, gathering firewood and setting up their tents. Marcus managed to catch a couple of fish, which they grilled over the campfire for dinner. As the sun began to set, the lake turned a deep shade of orange, and the woods behind them became dark and still. This is what camping's all about, Marcus said, stretching out by the fire. Yeah, it's so peaceful, Nicole agreed, though she kept glancing over her shoulder toward the woods. You all right? Alex asked. Nicole hesitated. It's nothing. Just it's so quiet, you know? Like too quiet. Alex shrugged. That's the whole point. No traffic, no people, just us. Nicole nodded, but the uneasy feeling lingered. That night, as they sat around the fire roasting marshmallows, they noticed something odd. The lake, which had been perfectly calm earlier, now had small ripples spreading across its surface. Is it the wind? Marcus asked, though there wasn't so much as a breeze. Could be fish, Alex said, though his tone was uncertain. Nicole squinted at the water. It's weird. It's not coming from one spot. It's like the whole lake is moving. They watched the ripples for a while, but nothing else happened. Eventually, they brushed it off as some natural phenomenon and went to bed. The next morning, Alex woke up early to go fishing. He stepped out of his tent and immediately froze. Guys, he called out. Where's my kayak? Nicole and Marcus emerged, still half asleep. What do you mean, where's your kayak? Marcus asked. Alex pointed to the shore. They had dragged all 3 kayaks up onto the sand the night before, but now only 2 remained. Maybe it drifted off, Nicole suggested. It wasn't that close to the water, Alex said, frowning. They scanned the lake but saw no sign of it. Frustrated, Alex decided to search along the shoreline while Nicole and Marcus stayed back to make breakfast. An hour later, he returned empty-handed. It's gone, he said. No tracks, no sign of it anywhere. It's like it just disappeared. Nicole looked uneasy. That doesn't make sense. Kayaks don't just vanish. Marcus tried to lighten the mood. Hey, at least we still have 2. Worst case, one of us doubles up with someone else. But the missing kayak set a strange tone for the rest of the day. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nicole was sitting by the water's edge, taking pictures of the sunset. She squinted at the far side of the lake. Hey, Alex, she called. What's up, he said, walking over. Nicole handed him her camera. Do you see that? Alex looked through the lens and saw what she was talking about. Faint shapes moving among the trees on the opposite shore. They were too far away to make out clearly, but they seemed to be human figures. Are those other campers? Nicole asked. No way, Alex said. This place is too remote, and we would have heard them paddling over. Marcus joined them, and Alex passed him the camera. Okay, that's creepy, Marcus said. What are they doing? The figures seemed to be pacing back and forth, their movements slow and deliberate. Maybe they're hunters or something, Alex said, though he didn't sound convinced. Let's just stay here and mind our own business, Nicole said, backing away from the water. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nicole was sitting by the water's edge, taking pictures of the sunset. She squinted at the far side of the lake. Hey, Alex, she called. What's up, he said, walking over. Nicole handed him her camera. Do you see that? Alex looked through the lens and saw what she was talking about. Faint shapes moving among the trees on the opposite shore. They were too far away to make out clearly, but they seemed to be human figures. Are those other campers? Nicole asked. No way, Alex said. This place is too remote, and we would have heard them paddling over. Marcus joined them, and Alex passed him the camera. Okay, that's creepy, Marcus said. What are they doing? The figures seemed to be pacing back and forth, their movements slow and deliberate. Maybe they're hunters or something, Alex said, though he didn't sound convinced. Let's just stay here and mind our own business, Nicole said, backing away from the water. That night, none of them got much sleep. Every little sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, seemed amplified. At some point, Alex heard footsteps near his tent. He held his breath, listening as they circled around, slow and deliberate. When morning finally came, they packed up as quickly as they could. As they pushed off in their remaining kayaks, Nicole glanced back toward the shore. Her heart sank. Standing at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees, was a figure. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching them. Paddle faster, Nicole whispered. They didn't look back again. By the time they reached the other side of the lake and loaded their gear into the car, they all felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I'm never coming back here, Marcus said as they drove away. Agreed, Alex and Nicole said in unison. They never figured out who, or what, had been watching them. But one thing was certain, the lake wasn't as peaceful as it seemed. A group of 4 friends, Jess, Rob, Tasha, and Ian, had been planning their camping trip for months. The plan was simple: a weekend in the forest, away from phones, work, and the chaos of daily life. The campsite was one of those off-the-beaten-path locations that Ian had discovered online. It wasn't officially maintained, but it was secluded, quiet, and surrounded by pristine nature. This is perfect, Jess said as they arrived at the site, a flat clearing nestled among towering trees. A small stream ran nearby, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. Rob grinned as he dropped his pack. Finally, no neighbors blasting music, no car alarms, just peace. They quickly set up their tents, 2 two-person setups, and spent the first day hiking, cooking over the campfire, and swapping stories as the sun set behind the trees. Best idea we've had in a while, Tasha said, leaning back in her chair as the fire crackled. Ian raised his mug. Here's to the first of many trips. The first night went smoothly. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. But the second night felt different. As they sat around the fire after dinner, an unusual stillness settled over the campsite. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, even the rustling of leaves, seemed to fade away. You guys notice how quiet it is? Jess asked, breaking the silence. Tasha nodded, her brow furrowing. Yeah, it's weird. It was so loud last night. It's probably nothing, Rob said, though he glanced uneasily toward the woods. Maybe the animals are just taking a break. Ian chuckled nervously. Or maybe they know something we don't. The group laughed, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Around midnight, everyone turned in for the night. Jess and Tasha shared one tent, while Rob and Ian shared the other. Sometime in the middle of the night, Jess woke up to the sound of rustling. She sat up, her heart pounding, and listened. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It sounded deliberate, like footsteps. Tasha, Jess whispered, shaking her friend awake. What? Tasha mumbled. Listen. Tasha froze, straining to hear. The rustling was faint but distinct, moving just outside their tent. Is it the guys? Tasha whispered. Jess unzipped the tent slightly and peeked out. The fire had died down to embers, and the clearing was bathed in dim moonlight. She saw nothing. I don't see anyone, Jess said, zipping the tent back up. They stayed awake for another hour, but the sound didn't return. Eventually, they fell back asleep. The next morning, Ian was the first to wake up. He stepped out of his tent, stretched, and froze. Guys, he called out. The others groggily emerged from their tents. What's up? Rob asked, rubbing his eyes. Ian pointed to the clearing. Where's our tent? Rob turned to look, and his jaw dropped. The tent they had shared the night before, along with their sleeping bags and gear, was gone. What the hell? Tasha said, walking over to the spot where the tent had been. The ground was bare, with no sign of their belongings. No drag marks, no torn fabric, nothing. It was right here, Rob said, his voice shaking. Did someone take it? Jess asked, looking around the campsite. But why would they take a tent and leave everything else? Ian said, pointing to the backpacks, cookware, and supplies still scattered around the fire pit. Maybe it was an animal? Tasha suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. An animal that knows how to fold up a tent and carry it off, Rob said. The group spent the morning searching the area, but found no trace of the missing tent. That afternoon, Jess and Tasha decided to refill their water bottles at the stream while Rob and Ian stayed back to rebuild the fire. As the two women knelt by the water, Jess froze. "Tasha," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What?" Tasha asked. Jess pointed across the stream. On the opposite bank, partially hidden by the trees, was what looked like their tent. "No way," Tasha said, squinting at it. The tent was upright but slightly collapsed, as if someone had hastily set it up and abandoned it. "Why would it be over there?" Jess asked. "I don't know," Tasha said, standing up. "Let's go check it out." As they started to cross the stream, a loud snapping sound came from the woods behind the tent. Both women froze. "Did you hear that?" Jess asked. Tasha nodded, her eyes wide. Another snap, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps retreating deeper into the forest. "Let's go back," Tasha said, grabbing Jess's arm. They hurried back to the campsite and told the others what they'd seen. By the time night fell, the group was on edge. They decided to stick close to the fire and keep watch in shifts. Around midnight, as Ian was on watch, he heard a soft thud behind him. He turned and saw a small pile of rocks on the edge of the clearing. "Guys, wake up," Ian said, shaking Rob awake. "What is it?" Rob asked groggily. Ian pointed to the rocks. That wasn't there before. By the time Jess and Tasha joined them, another thud echoed through the clearing. This time, a rock landed a few feet from the fire. "Who's out there?" Rob shouted, shining his flashlight into the woods. The beam caught something, or someone moving between the trees. It was too fast to make out any details, but it was enough to make the group pack up their essentials. "We're leaving," Jess said firmly. They hiked back to their car in the dark, moving as quickly as they could. The entire time, they felt like they were being watched. When they finally reached the parking lot, they loaded their gear and drove off without looking back. "I don't care how cheap or remote it is," Rob said as they sped down the road. "I'm never camping here again." The missing tent was never explained, and though the group tried to rationalize what had happened, none of them could shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been messing with them. It was a late summer evening when three childhood friends, Leah, Ben, and Marcus, decided to go camping at a small, tucked-away campsite near Eagles Crest Lake. The place was known for its beautiful views and serene atmosphere. It was also far from any town or cell service, making it the perfect spot to disconnect. The group arrived late in the afternoon, set up their tents near the edge of the lake, and spent the evening fishing and cooking over a small fire. The peaceful surroundings were exactly what they had hoped for, and as the sun set, they settled in for a relaxing night under the stars. "This is the life," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair and looking up at the sky. "Yeah, we should make this an annual thing," Leah agreed, tossing another log onto the fire. Ben nodded. "Just us, nature, and no distractions." But as the fire crackled and the night deepened, their perfect evening took an unexpected turn. It was around 10 p.m. when Leah first noticed something odd. "Guys, did you see that?" she asked, pointing toward the trail they had come in on. Ben and Marcus turned to look, but saw nothing. "See what?" Ben asked. "I thought I saw someone walking near the trees," Leah said, her voice uncertain. Marcus shrugged. "Probably your imagination. It's dark, and shadows can play tricks on you." Leah nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. An hour later, as the fire burned lower, the group heard a faint crunching sound, footsteps coming from the direction of the trail. "Okay, did you hear that?" Leah whispered. This time, Ben and Marcus nodded. "Maybe it's another camper?" Ben suggested, though his voice was uneasy. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the trail. "Hello," he called out. At first, there was no response. Then, from the shadows, a voice called back, "Mind if I join you?" A man stepped into the firelight, wearing a worn-out jacket and carrying a small backpack. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. "Sorry to bother you," the man said. "I was hiking and got turned around. Saw your fire and figured I'd ask if I could sit for a bit." The group exchanged glances. Something about the man's sudden appearance felt off, but they didn't want to be rude. "Sure," Ben said hesitantly. "Have a seat." The man smiled and sat down on a log near the fire. "Name's Eric," he said, setting his backpack at his feet. "Leah," she replied cautiously. "Ben." Marcus. The conversation started off light, with Eric sharing stories about his hiking trips and the places he had visited. But as time went on, his stories grew darker. He talked about people going missing in the woods, unexplained sounds, and campers who were never found. The group listened politely, but Leah's unease grew with every word. After nearly an hour of tense conversation, Eric leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Have you ever felt like you're being watched out here?" he asked. The question hung in the air, and no one answered right away. "Sometimes it feels like the forest has eyes," Eric continued, his voice low. "Like it knows you're here." Leah glanced at Ben and Marcus, both of whom looked as uneasy as she felt. "Well, it's late," Marcus said, standing up. "We should probably call it a night." Eric smiled faintly. "Of course. Thanks for letting me crash your fire for a bit." He stood, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and walked back toward the trail. "Good night," he called over his shoulder. The group watched him disappear into the darkness. After nearly an hour of tense conversation, Eric leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Have you ever felt like you're being watched out here?" he asked. The question hung in the air, and no one answered right away. "Sometimes it feels like the forest has eyes," Eric continued, his voice low. "Like it knows you're here." Leah glanced at Ben and Marcus, both of whom looked as uneasy as she felt. "Well, it's late," Marcus said, standing up. "We should probably call it a night." Eric smiled faintly. "Of course. Thanks for letting me crash your fire for a bit." He stood, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and walked back toward the trail. "Good night," he called over his shoulder. The group watched him disappear into the darkness. The group decided to pack up as quickly as possible. The beautiful campsite no longer felt peaceful. It felt menacing. As they loaded their gear into the car, Leah glanced back toward the woods. For a split second, she thought she saw movement among the trees. "Let's go," she said, climbing into the car. As they drove away, none of them spoke. They didn't want to acknowledge what they had all been thinking. Eric wasn't lost. He wasn't a hiker, and he definitely wasn't alone.